Out of the Ground, Reading the Book of Dust by Philip Pullman. Episode 1, To Be a Philosopher's Apprentice. This is Wesley Shantz. I'm a teacher at the community school in Spokane, Washington, a sometime preceptor and presenter with the space program at Signum University Online. And with friends and fellow video game academicians, I write and podcast more or less weekly on video games and literature at videogameacademia.org. I'm currently on paternity leave with my third child, and I imagine this is something like what a real academic would call a sabbatical. Only when you're writing a book or paper, in my limited experience, you don't usually have to burp it, change its diaper, hold it till it falls asleep. Maybe metaphorically. Anyhow, we're here on this metaphorical sabbatical because I've decided to dust off a long-term project, to be, if not a philosopher's apprentice, then a storyteller's, a poet's, and a myth-maker's apprentice. For Philip Pullman has been in all of these activities a master and a role model for me over many years. Though I've never met him, he has connected me to many more of his own masters, such as John Milton, William Blake, Kleist, Keats. He's put me on the tracks of his bêtes noires, Tolkien, Lewis, and the Christian scriptures, as filtered through the Reformation Protestantism in which Pullman himself was raised. His grandfather, with whom he lived for a time growing up, was an Anglican clergyman, and I, in my own way, was raised in a similar tradition, growing up in the 90s in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., where Sunday mornings were given over to soccer games and Presbyterian services in approximately equal measure. My long-term, long-distance, experimental theological apprenticeship to Pullman, and through him to a whole philosophical, poetic, and religious tradition, continues to profoundly shape how I see the world. And I feel confident that I can affirm it leads me to focus on the important place of reading and discussing books in it. Short of raising my own kids and teaching my students to do the same, I can think of no better way to spend my time and my talent, such as it is, than in telling whoever you are who's listening, read Pullman with me. Read anything, so long as it pulls you into the kind of passionate engagement with language and ideas, and wonder and awe-filled enchantment with the world, and with the human experience, that I'm going to strive to express as I find it, in Pullman's words, over these next many hours. With the release of the third volume of the Book of Dust, Lyra's full story has been let loose in the world, in all the many worlds, and so the time has come for another long-form series of discussions and commentaries on the works of Philip Pullman. For it would seem as though the windows from one world to another have not all been closed, despite what we were led to believe at the end of his dark materials. And as for the Republic of Heaven spoken of there, and so stirringly evoked in Pullman's nonfiction, his interviews, his public remarks, as a democracy of reading, if we were expecting to find it in the Rosefield at last, it might prove elusive, perhaps disappointing, and anyhow somewhat different than we supposed. But after all, resourceful readers, like Lyra and her friends, can always find a way to reopen the windows. And when we leave them at the end of the final book, sharing poems and stories, something like what was promised seems to be what they are at work building together. A worthy effort, if a quixotic one, and one I invite you to join in with me. So, continuing the podcast format of my prior series on the Golden Compass, the Subtle Knife, and the Amber Spyglass, along with several video games, and in the hopes of contributing to a more complete understanding of the place of Pullman's writing in the wider culture, this project will consist of commentaries on each chapter of the Book of Dust, as well as conversations with scholars and other readers, fans and critics alike. Wherever possible, I will trace Pullman's references and allusions to their probable sources, whether in his own previous books or in the literature, art, historical events, and personal experiences that have most likely influenced him. My main purpose, however, and the why behind all this effort, is to attempt to say, in as clear and interesting a way as possible, what Pullman's work has meant for me and for the many readers, those writers and aspiring writers, those teachers and students, the young and the old, readers like me that he's influenced over the years, telling Lyra's story. I think it's a wonderful story and a compelling one. For many other readers, and for me in many places, it may be a challenging one too. For some it is nothing special, or it is even disreputable, dangerous. And another of my goals with this round of reading, conversations, is to reach out to a wider variety of interlocutors and to engage with a wider range of critics and those who even outright dismiss Pullman than I have done in my previous forays. In particular, I want to be cognizant of the religious, philosophical, and poetic stakes in the encounter with Pullman's formidable powers of narrative and polemic. The Book of Dust, if not his swan song, will likely prove to be one of Pullman's last artistic statements. More and more I am persuaded that at the heart of his works, from his little-known early novels through to the poignant, puzzling final pages of The Rose Field, there live serious questions for people who hold all manner of commitments to faith, art, politics. What sorts of relationships to others, to institutions, to values, to our own imagination are we responsible for? What sorts might we long to be free from? What kinds of communities are possible to hold together in a world driven by money, fear, violence, ignorance? What happens when the traditional structures start to break down? And when even apparently inevitable political or economic orders standing in for the religious become unstable in turn? What is the nature of dust, finally? I think that honest responses to these sorts of questions will tend to be illuminated by recurring to them patiently, charitably, and with an open mind. For myself, my faith in God, the sort of God who Pullman, far from killing, brings to life by his negative capability in his story of dust, and in the manifold, splendid, awful capacities of human beings, made in the image of God as we are, out of the dust, only grows with each visit to Pullman's many worlds, and with each return to our own. Linked in the description wherever you're listening, you can find the course page for this as yet, at the time of this first recording, mostly imaginary and purely audit-only course, where you'll find audio and the notes to each episode as well, with more links and recommendations for further reading. With all that said, it's time this first episode got properly underway, and so let's first look at the front matter and read our way through Chapter 1 of the Book of Dust, Volume 1, La Belle Sauvage, Chapter 1 being the Terrace Room. To start with, when he sits down to write, Pullman has said the first question that presents itself is where to put the camera, so to speak. And when we set to reading, we're first met with the choice of where to invest our money and attention, just the latter if it's a library copy. The edition that I have of La Belle Sauvage is a signed copy. It's one of my most treasured possessions, along with the first edition of The Golden Compass from my childhood, and a signed copy of Lyra's Oxford and Once Upon a Time in the North, the latter of which was the one time that I was in Philip Pullman's presence to have him sign some books. I think the other is The Magic Pudding. But anyhow, this U.S. edition of the Book of Dust is predominantly blue. Uh, there are differences to the UK edition, but so far as I know, they're limited to the cover and the presentation, not the text, with a few minor exceptions. Less than the Northern Lights or Golden Compass name change, the US edition opts to make the cover text blue on white and white on blue, while in the UK the font is gold. On both, the Book of Dust is written real big, and Volume 1 La Belle Sauvage is in smaller font, although this gets reversed in the US for both of the subsequent volumes. They have their titles much larger than the overarching title, The Book of Dust. While in the UK, the top billing remains The Book of Dust through all three. And now, maybe these are small details, but it is the reader's first impression, and it communicates, on the whole, a more unified or less unified framework to the story as a whole. Now, iconography is of interest to Pullman, we know, from the design of the alethiometer, from his drawings for the chapter headings of his dark materials, and from statements that he makes in pieces such as his Borderlands talk. And this particular image is one that comes up in some places, I think it's the ISIS lecture, as the image for writing itself. It's like being on a boat at night. So to stick just to the US copy for now, writing the letters against the sky, more literal than the kind of communication that animates nature in Lyre's Oxford, for example, there are also these lines like an etching or a print or a fingerprint that run through the whole, and they're painted with the powder of dust like white speckles, influenced perhaps by the HBO series or perhaps by the imagery of Malcolm's aura, or aurora as he calls it, the scintillating rings that he begins to see partway through the book. And nestling in the bottom corner, by the name La Belle Sauvage in small print, is the little boat itself. The two figures that are visible in it, one manning the oar and the other protectively curled in the bow, carrying someone else that we can't quite see. Like the boat journey with the ferryman in the Amber Spyglass, I think this is a mythological image. It would fit on the edge of the alethiometer. It's one that Pullman uses also to talk about the craft of writing and his own sea journeys as a child and the time he spent living near the seaside in Wales. These are all surely part of the inspiration for this image as well. And he talks about building his books out of such images, which he rearranges to fit the best pattern for his story. But this is a river that has flooded, not a sea. Now, something else from Genesis and the myths of surrounding cultures, and for many others around the world, is of course just such a flood, a universal flood. The story of the Garden of Eden is central to his dark materials, and we are given to understand that the story of the flood, a decreation, is going to be at the heart of this book. In my signed copy, there is also a variation of this illustration that shows the same kind of scene from a slightly different perspective. It's lower down level with the water, and it's a page I think that's specially for a signed frontispiece with the text that reads like a dart, taken from later in the book. I think it's in chapter 15, which is in many ways the turning point of the book. I'll have images of these wherever you're reading, or rather listening to this. Now, the writing on the side of the canoe is clearly visible above the waves, while still the child Lyra, who is present for nearly the whole of the journey, and she is also described by those words, La Belle Sauvage, just as well as the boat that carries them. She remains invisible. La Belle Sauvage, French. It can mean something like the beautiful savage, or if you sort of mix up the words, I think it could also mean something like the wild beauty. It conjures those illustrations in books from his own boyhood, like 100 Million Francs, whose image of a girl character helped inspire Philip's picture of Lyra. And it also conjures all those forests savage of Arthurian and medieval romance, particularly as transmitted through Edmund Spenser. The root meaning of sauvage has Dante's selva oscura, dark wood, behind it as well. As for La Belle, for Pullman, as for all poets, she could also be his Beatrice, his beloved, his muse. The dual applicability of the title to the character and the vessel, to the person and to the craft within the book bearing that heraldic title, signals the way in which the bearer and the born are really one. The story and the language in which it is told are equally a flow of words, elemental as wind and water, at once beautiful and savage. The overarching series titled The Book of Dust suggests, in line with the artifacts of his Dark Materials volumes and the forces at work in Milton's poem that inspires it, suggests some physical object with special powers. And while there are many new items introduced, including several books in the series, none of them is called by the name The Book of Dust. The canoe is not magical per se, although it does seem to be alive to Malcolm. It is crucial to the story in just the way that the alethiometer, the knife, the spyglass are. And as for Lyra, whatever she may prove to be, she's certainly central to the story as a whole. In the same way as there is no single Book of Dust, no one actually says his dark materials outright, but only dark matter or dust in the original books. But as far as I can recall, we don't refer with this phrase, Book of Dust, to any line of verse or scientific theory in the way that his Dark Materials is a direct allusion to poetry. So it's intriguing to me anyway, that however remote Pullman had in mind a certain image or motif of writing in dust or with dust as a possibility for this title. And this image is one that turns up here and there in the Bible, as I've traced in another essay called Reading on the Ground. Whether it's intended or not, the resonances to images like Jesus' writing on the ground in the book of John are there, but they also might refer to the kind of activity that we see Dr. Mary Malone doing with the I Ching in his Dark Materials. And of course, in some sense, the Book of Dust may just be the book that we're reading. It is possible that this title just sounded too good to pass up, because he's talked about it for almost 20 years now, almost from the moment that he finished the Amber Spyglass, and certainly from the time that Lyra's Oxford and the other little books, the companion books, were released. So I'll have to get to work on a chronology, a bibliography, to get straight exactly when these things all happen. But in broad strokes, it looks to me like the Belle Sauvage would be roughly central to the overarching story, although perhaps something else like Demon Voices, or even The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ, or one of those little books, could occupy that position. There are going to be interludes in this commentary series in which I will discuss other works of Pullman's since his Dark Materials. I'll be doing conversations with scholars and fans and critics, as I mentioned. I would also like to look at some of the adaptations extensions, interpretations, applications, and the influences that Pullman's work has had in the years since. Now, okay, whereas each of the Book of Dust volumes is part of a whole, just as his Dark Materials is, I'm actually unsure of how much the separate wholes stand on their own and how much they necessarily all cohere into something we might call Pullman's oeuvre writ large. But they certainly shed light on one another, as do those little books and the Sally Lockharts and so on. In this series, I'm not going to be nailing down every detail and arriving at a completely finished, definitive, discursive analysis of these books. Rather, what I'm proposing to do here is preliminary, tentative, and I'm going to be seeing what each of these books has to say on its own. And then we can look at how it would relate to the rest, which I'm still very much in the process of rereading and thinking about. That is to say, how these books relate to his Dark Materials to form a larger whole, how they relate to Pullman's other works, sort of infra-Pullman writing, and then also how they relate to books that they in turn allude to beyond the writing of Philip Pullman. So, the titles of these individual volumes seem to carry on the pattern of referring to particular things in the worlds of Pullman's work, though only the Belle Sauvage is actually instrumental in the same way as the original alethiometer, knife, and spyglass were. The Secret Commonwealth and the Rose Field seem to be a little bit different in kind. Like the alethiometer, like the knife, the Belle Sauvage will also be broken in the course of the story. Each of these instruments has its metaphorical importance that we can translate, if we choose, into the world that we inhabit. These are gifts that the storyteller would like to give us, I think. Gifts of reading, of protecting, of traveling, and of seeing what is there. As I mentioned, La Belle Sauvage could also allude to a muse, or beloved of Pullman's, and I think we can look at this in a couple different ways. The first is the dedication, probably the most important. This dedication is to Jude, who is his wife, Judith, his wife of many years. There's bound to be a story there. And maybe the significant portion of this story that's dedicated to taking care of the baby Lyra helps to give an account of this dedication, if one is needed. Philip and Jude raised 2 children together, and in places he writes about them and about their family life together, but this is not a subject that I either know much about or feel terribly comfortable speculating on. I do have a passage here from Pullman's autobiographical sketch, I Have a Feeling This All Belongs to Me, where he writes, quote, "So, as of April 1993, Jude is studying to become a hypnotherapist. She is a healer. I've always known that. But she hasn't been sure what path to take until recently. She's the sort of person who can't stand at a bus stop for 2 minutes without someone pouring out his or her troubles to her. She seems to radiate some kind of sympathy beam that makes people confide in her and feel better for it. But she's never been sure that she ought to give that sort of help professionally, despite my urging her to for years. However, having looked at many different kinds of therapy, she's decided that this is the one she wants to take up. I'm sure she's right. And she's the first and best critic of my work. If she approves of something, I know it's all right." That's the end of the quote there. So then we next have the epigraph, and this time it comes from Louis MacNeice's short poem, Snow, from 1967. The passage reads, "World is crazier, and more of it than we think, incorrigibly plural." The fragmentary grammar and the ellipses at the end indicate that there is more of this, and indeed there is, so I'll read it in full. Snow by Louis MacNeice. The room was suddenly rich, and the great bay window was spawning snow and pink roses against it, soundlessly collateral and incompatible. World is suddener than we fancy it. World is crazier and more of it than we think, incorrigibly plural. I peel and portion a tangerine and spit the pips and feel the drunkenness of things being various. And the fire flames with a bubbling sound, for world is more spiteful and gay than one supposes. On the tongue, on the eyes, on the ears, in the palms of one's hands, there is more than glass between the snow and the huge roses. Again, that's from 1967. This is taken from poetry.org, I think. Now, Paradise Lost by John Milton, This Ent, or even The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, which turns out to be the main source of poetry for the epigraphs that will bookend the final pages of each volume, that is the first and the third, I think. And yet, taking these lines out of context as they're given, we can see why they appeal to Philip Pullman. The crazier world, the mad river. And the more we think that is quoted there certainly pertains to a story that Pullman had supposedly thought was completed. The incorrigibly plural is fitting in at least two ways. It's plural because of the many worlds that are integral to the structure of Pullman's adventures, and these crossings from one to another, and incorrigibly so because, after all, the attempt to fix, knit up, redeem, save these worlds, to make them correct, or at least possible or liable to correction, corrigible, this has been rendered, it seems, impossible. Pullman's worldview is one that muses on, delights in, the multiplicity and complexity of these worlds, does not want to reduce them, and does not want to recognize that they have a maker. Pullman's many worlds can't be reduced to just one real world, or even, as he says, a spiritual and material binary that would be presided over by a church because of the hierarchy obtaining between them. And this view of his has ramifications for the theoretically infinite worlds of Lyra's, and according to experimental theology, or physics as we call it, that does not really have room for a moment of creation, much less a moment of salvation. This is the world that we begin anew in La Belle Sauvage. And this world will also prove to have more to it than it seems, layers of meaning that were not dreamt of before in his Dark Materials. This is a world that we visit some years before the Golden Compass and its events have taken place. The story is set years before, yet Pullman insists on calling La Belle Sauvage not a prequel or sequel in terms of its composition, but an equal to that watershed work. And incredibly, La Belle Sauvage delivers on that promise, reimagining and expanding the world as it was given to us, bringing it into vertical connections with a kind of historical foundation and a Therian substrate, and giving that depth and heft, that filling out of a number of minor characters and side locations that we'll recognize from earlier books, particularly from The Golden Compass and Lyra's Oxford. Snow is an image of dust, perhaps, that lends a shine to things, that more to the world that MacNeice seems to be wrestling with, that more than the glass between him and the rose, and to that significance that's buried in ordinary things, that shines forth, but in such a way that we are ordinarily blind and unresponsive to it. And I think this is the force of poetry and stories like Pullman's, to reveal the enchantment of everyday things. I think this is the rose that's echoed in the name of the priory, which Malcolm, curiously, has never thought to wonder about before 3 visitors ask him about it one night. And we never do see him ask the nuns about that rose. So it's left to us to wonder. Pullman does comment somewhere in an interview that he's never felt that the world was disenchanted, for him at least. And if you're interested in the real world analogs to these locations, a video by Gabriel Schenk about the Priory of Godstow and the Trout Inn is available on YouTube. One final thought about the poem, though. This tangerine makes me think of T.S. Eliot's love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, who does not dare to eat a peach, or asks himself if he does. And the pips, the spitting of them, is going to have its echo in other ways in a couple of chapters to come. There's always more that we could say about the poem, but leaving it for now, this brings us finally to Chapter 1, the Terrace Room. I'll just read the opening paragraph here, because we do need the voice of the narrator, now that we've had the voice of the poet that he places as an epigraph. 1. The Terrace Room. 3 miles up the River Thames from the centre of Oxford, some distance from where the great colleges of Jordan, Gabriel, Balliol, and 24 others contended for mastery in the boat races, out where the city was only a collection of towers and spires in the distance, over the misty levels of Portmeadow, there stood the Priory of Godstow, where the gentle nuns went about their holy business, and on the opposite bank from the Priory there was an inn called the Trout. Again, we get the all-important voice, the cadence of the narrator, situating us in the story by his rhythm and his language, as much as by the content of the words themselves. Along with the setting of the river, the city, the priory, the inn, we get a sense of a balanced and ordered world, the way that these are juxtaposed against one another, both grammatically and geographically. The only difference, the only odd piece out here, is the way that the priory, which doesn't exist, and its nuns are described, at least briefly, whereas the inn, which does exist, is only named. And this leads us into the following description. I'll just read a bit more. The inn was an old stone-built, rambling, comfortable sort of place. There was a terrace above the river where peacocks, one called Norman and the other called Barry, stalked among the drinkers, helping themselves to snacks without the slightest hesitation, and occasionally lifting their heads to utter ferocious and meaningless screams. There was a saloon bar where the gentry, if college scholars count as gentry, took their ale and smoked their pipes. There was a public bar where watermen and farm laborers sat by the fire or played darts, or stood at the bar gossiping or arguing or simply getting quietly drunk. There was a kitchen where the landlord's wife cooked a great joint every day, with a complicated arrangement of wheels and chains turning a spit over an open fire. And there was a potboy called Malcolm Polstead. So we can see again the balance between the first 2 paragraphs, the way that they both end with that identical construction. There was called. So we get a parallel between the place and the person, and a onward flowing effect of leading into the next paragraph, which will continue the description and the filling out of who that person is or what that place is like. The place itself is clearly important here. The terrace with its peacocks, whose meaningless screams are quite the provocation to the reader of Lyra's Oxford, where the birds mean something. The boat races from the first sentence embody that competition among the colleges as much as the scholars, the gentry, and the public are brought into somewhat playful contention. We see them playing darts, for example. Again, that word dart is going to be kind of a theme in this book. And the fire is an image from the poem, Snow. The fire is not only there for the comfort of the customers, but also is integral to the hearth in the kitchen. And of course, that is where we are first introduced to Malcolm himself, our protagonist. This name, Malcolm Polstead, could be Shakespeare's Macbeth on the brain, where Malcolm is the heir to the throne. Or again, it could just be a name that sounded good. When you need it shortened, you can say Mal. We'll get that later. Which is almost like Will, upside down, as it were. And Polstead sounds like he is, steady, upright, sturdy. We know this name, Malcolm Polstead, from Lyra's Oxford, where he figures briefly as the tutor, who also helps situate us in time with respect to that book. We are meeting him as an 11-year-old here. So we have a general sense about how far in the past we might be, because he's a young professor or scholar in Lyra's Oxford, which takes place just after the events of the Amber Spyglass by a couple of years, I think. Can't remember. Again, that chronology. Malcolm, again, 11-year-old, attends Overcott Elementary School. He's happiest when playing with his demon Asta in their canoe. Her name means something like star in Latin, and in Italian, strangely enough, means something like pole. Huh. Anyway, we see him painting the name La Belle Sauvage over and over as his witty fool of a friend keeps vandalizing the V into an S, making it into those sausages the peacocks will keep snatching in Hannah Relf's memory. I'm tempted to think of those peacocks as alluding to the apes and peacocks of King Solomon, but that's probably too much of a stretch. We see the rule of three, or three and then one more, in storytelling as in telling jokes, of which this instance of the painting of the name over is both. And we see that they come to a truce after Malcolm throws them into the water. Then we meet Alice, our second most important character in the story, perhaps. And we don't realize it yet, but we do know her too from The Golden Compass. Her name, Alice, carries the Oxford lore of adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass of Lewis Carroll, and with it the uncomfortable proximity to underage sexuality that's implicit in that lore, and the concern that the Church of Lyra's world, and that is one of its glaring hypocrisies in our own. We see her jackdaw demon hasn't yet settled, but the initial form it takes here is one of the ones that Pullman has claimed might be his own. Alice's is the first voice of direct speech dialogue, if we don't count that indirect speech, that laughter and truce-making that's reported between Malcolm and his demon and his friend. She teases Malcolm, and he again eventually retaliates, or in this case his demon does. And his mother is the next speaker. She says she's not sympathetic. She says that Alice has a nasty mind. She should keep to herself. And as little sympathy as Malcolm and his mother seem to have for Alice, I think that there may be some that the reader should begin to feel. Particularly if we think about the genealogy of that so-called nasty mind. What might lay behind her teasing provocations of Malcolm. The way that the two take not the slightest notice of each other is a recurring, and I would even say a favorite phrase of Pullman's. It's in practically every one of his stories at least once. This theme of paying attention, or in this case, pointedly making a show of not paying attention, or not seeming to, is crucial to whatever the meaning of dust might prove to be. Overhearing will also be a key theme, in this and many of his stories. We hear or overhear about the venal rascality and the helpless idiocy of the government and the society, but also of more philosophical matters about the age of the stars. This is very like in The Golden Compass, how we hear Lyra imagining that the stars have demons and that it's the job of experimental theologians to talk to them and listen to their answers. And the way that Malcolm thinks of himself as lucky is actually, again, going to bring us back to Pullman's autobiographical sketch, because Pullman seems to think of himself as lucky too. Here's the quote. I have too many memories of my time at sea to include them all here, but I'll add two more. One is of a sailor who showed me how to sweep a floor. This is an image we get in The Golden Compass. I was watching him sweep up some dust, and I wanted to try, so he lent me his broom and told me that you always sweep the dust away from you, never towards you. I've done that every time I've swept a floor since. The other memory is of a girl my age. She was called Geraldine. She was dark-haired and pretty, and the first day we were aboard the ship I saw her and fell in love. And partway through the voyage, somewhere in the Indian Ocean, one of the other children showed us all how to play postman's knock. And so the very thing I most desperately wanted came about. I was able to kiss Geraldine. I must have been 8 years old, and I vividly remember thinking as I kissed her in that half-darkened cabin how lucky I was, that I only had to think of a thing and it would happen. And that sense of being blessed by fortune has never entirely left me. He comes back to this idea of being lucky and the way that you can have your wishes come true in stories at the end of the piece. It's really a wonderful bit of writing. So Pullman clearly has put some of himself into these characters, and particularly into Malcolm in his luck, and in the way that he doesn't have a nickname, but if he did, it would be Professor. He's, in a way, already got what he dreams of. And that is what he'll be, or close enough anyway, a scholar. And a spy. And the way in which Malcolm is mostly not noticed, which also does him no harm, it's part of his luck perhaps, again makes us think of Will Perry, the second protagonist in His Dark Materials. The next name we get that I think is significant is the name of Saint Rosamond. This is the name of the priory, which again has not fallen into ruin just yet in the story. The name Rosamond conjures up the image of the rose from the Snow poem, but more likely it is supposed to refer to the history and the folklore that surrounds the fair Rosamond, the mistress of King Henry II. Consult Wikipedia and other folklore sources for more on that story, I guess. We hear about Mr. Taphouse, the carpenter. I think that name is self-explanatory. We hear about Benedicta, whose name means something like blessed. She is the abbess, and we see her ferried down the river in Malcolm's canoe to deliver precious parcels for the Zeppelin. And if that bit of steampunk idyllic world building weren't enough, we also hear them having a sort of game in which they gently plumb the depths of grammatical speech, of proper English. So she corrects Malcolm's speech and he asks her questions. These are very like the language games that Pullman would have played as an English teacher for the time in his life when he had that profession, and probably something like the language games that he talks about playing with his own children as well. They invent languages together, he says, in the same autobiographical sketch. Language games, of course, also makes me think of Wittgenstein, who is cited in Stephen Hawking, which we'll get to next time. This is contemporary philosophy and its role to understand and interpret language. So what they're talking about, how to tie things neatly, how to do things in a neat way and to make things neat. Um, in a way, this is the craftsmanship of writing itself, of speaking too, um, of anything done well that I think is uh, deeply embedded in Pullman's work as we leave off. Lyra is learning to do the alethiometer consciously rather than uh, through intuition at the end of his Dark Materials. Um, so whether it's a real world sort of thing like carpentry or a more fairy tale type of thing, um, doing something well and taking pride in one's work seems to be close to the heart of the Bildungsroman uh, novel of education that Pullman's drawing on here. Um, moving on. We hear about the espaliers for the fruit trees. So again, that Garden of Eden imagery. We hear about the nuns singing and their kindness as well as their garden. This again makes us think back to the drubbing that organized religion comes in for in his Dark Materials, and how this is a very different portrayal of organized religion. It seems to draw more directly on Pullman's grandfather, the preacher, and this is also a thread that we'll pick up when we look at his very first novel, The Haunted Storm. By and by, we'll consider the ways in which threads, loose threads, ones that are not tied up neatly in that very first book, seem to be picked up in his later work. So Malcolm's questioning of Benedicta, of Fenella, borders on the irreverent, the impertinent, the downright rude. She tells him to his question about God creating the world in only 6 days, but then asking about fossils and things, that days were much longer then. She has a kind of simple-hearted faith, and one that Malcolm will only press so far in his questioning against. But then he's distracted by the type of knife that she's using on the rhubarb. She discusses the oxalic acid, so she's not so simple-minded. And he likes the word itself, and then comes back to another word that he was interested in, the chasubles, which those priests in London seem to wear out so quickly, and the nuns are sewing and sending to them. But the squirrel demon of Fenella tut-tuts about his question about sewing. This seems to be a sore subject for her. And his backhanded compliment about her cooking does not entirely smooth things over when he says that her pastries are almost as good as his mother's. So we see Malcolm here as very innocent, wanting to be helpful, very curious, but perhaps slightly annoying, and maybe even what today might be called neurodivergent or on the spectrum in his apparent fixations. Now, these leftovers that they're making into different shapes. This is the one place so far that I've seen an actual divergence between the UK text and the US edition that I read. Because when I listened to this, it's not just making into crosses and fish, but also into palm leaves. I think this is a significant passage for a couple of reasons. Not just that they would bother with changing such a apparently small detail, but also because of the religious meaning that these symbols have. The cross, the crucifixion, the palm leaves, the resurrection. The fish as a symbol for the earliest gatherings of Christian believers, the faithful. And the fish, of course, is also of key importance in that little scene in the Golden Compass where Lyra finds the boy Tony Makarios in the Arctic village in the fish house. This is the character that's conflated with Billy Costa in the HBO series. And so I venture to say that Jesus the Messiah is present in these books, and not only God the Father. Um, he's hidden in plain sight in this series that's infamous for its portrayal of the death of God. And he's present in this humble faith of Sister Fenella and the other nuns, in these pastries that are fashioned for tea by her, as she says, great fat fingers. And this is one of Pullman's favorite images of domestic tranquility, having tea at the end of I Was a Rat, for example. Um, this is going to be the image also of Malcolm's sort of intellectual awakening when he goes to discuss books with um, Hannah Ralph. Uh, we hear a little bit about people visiting the nuns. A princess was there being punished, apparently, and although it's not stated, presumably this was for some sort of infidelity or lack of chastity along the lines of the historical, folklorical Rosamond. We hear about Malcolm putting his generous tips into a walrus type of piggy bank, and maybe we're supposed to think of Lewis Carroll here with a walrus saying that the time has come to talk of many things. We hear about a gun that Malcolm might be saving up for, though he doesn't ask his father. He sort of assumes that it won't be allowed, and so there's this idea of a prohibition as well as something of a Chekhov's gun, or the lack thereof. Um, this is where we also hear that he most would have liked not to inherit the inn, though that would be lovely because you can learn a lot there, but to be a scholar and to study the deepest nature of things. This is where the line comes, to be a philosopher's apprentice. Now that would be a fine thing. I have to agree. Um, I think this is perhaps playing on the sorcerer's apprentice motif of being careful what you wish for. And it's also a kind of dynamic that Pullman is putting into play in his Scarecrow and his Servant, a Candide type of story, where the apprentice is, of course, the true hero for his Don Quixote-like master. So, finally, all of this setup leads us to our inciting event for the plot proper in the story, really getting underway, because one evening in the middle of winter, 3 men arrive by an Berwick, that is electric car. Uh, Malcolm's father thinks they're likely foreign because they don't come to the bar to order drinks, but go back to that terrace room. And Malcolm, when he goes to wait on them, can tell their quality at a glance. The oldest and the one who seems to be in charge utters a French phrase, "Le patron mange ici," when Malcolm praises the food and suggests that they might want some. They order uh, claret, and one of them at least orders rum. And now I think that this must be the third man with the black mustache and the dark eyes. But the fact that this man is in fact dark-skinned is only mentioned a good deal later, when this is revealed to be the deputy director, Al-Kindi, and North African. Um, I think that this inclusion of rum uh, alongside the claret of the scholarly gentleman and the political gentleman is perhaps going to take us back to Pullman's work in The Broken Bridge, where he deals most directly with questions of race. Um, but that will be a story for another time. So they ask him, who was St. Rosamond? And he can only come up with an image to answer that she must be the one standing in the big rose in the stained glass window. He says he'll ask the nuns. I think this is a puzzle that's meant to be left for the reader, and I think that we might only fully understand this puzzle, the significance of the rose, if we think about the whole of that poem from which Pullman takes his epigraph, and if we get all the way to the rose field at the other end of this series. We'll see if we can make it. Now, he does mention then that he knows the nuns well, that he is on good terms with them, and he offers to light the fire. So there's that image again from the poem. Um, they order that famous roast beef, and his demon points out that they were already aware of the nuns being there, that they were rather testing Malcolm himself to see if he and his demon told the truth. He has a brief paragraph here where we learn a bit about the nature of demons, that they have these intuitions that have proved reliable in Malcolm's case in the past. So again, this idea of proving related to testing. Um, so his feelings are hers, just as her intuitions are really his, because they are one being, we're told. Um, his father points out that these are no ordinary guests. This is Lord Nugent, who was the Lord Chancellor of England, and so Malcolm had better answer all of his questions. So by the light of naphtha lamp and that fire in the grate, he continues their discussion. He allows him to be called just Sir, so that in case he's traveling incognito, his cover isn't blown. They talk about the Egyptians and the horse fair, which is given a precise time of year, finally. Turns out it is in July, which doesn't entirely make sense with the way that the weather's described and other things in the Golden Compass, but maybe there's more than one horse fair. I'm not sure. We learn that the nuns have to earn their living, something Malcolm might not have thought too much about. One of them asks if they make perfumes. Again, this is jumping us all the way ahead to the rose field, where rose perfume is going to be so important. But Malcolm says, no, it's just their vegetables and their sowing, and they must have money from somewhere because they buy fish from Medley Pond. And in the old days, the inns didn't exist, and so if people needed a place to stay, it would have been the priory. His word for rest here, he can't quite get it out. It's convalescing. So again, this helping and teaching of language in the course of everyday discussions, or not so ordinary ones. But the word rest is, of course, that missing seventh day that Malcolm did not ask about when he asked about the 6 days of creation, because the word in Hebrew is the same as the root of the name Noah. This is not my own insight, but one that I owe to the Bible Project podcast and classes and videos. This is an important source of a different perspective from Pullman's on the scriptures and the ways in which they are poetically arranged. And if, again, we read them charitably and are open to the spirit in which they are written, I think that that perspective can be very much enriched and very much enter into a fruitful dialogue with Pullman's reading of those famous stories. With that said, I think we have to note that there are apples from the Priory orchard for dessert here. They ask Malcolm if the nuns have ever been known to look after an infant, a baby. And this is a mystery, because they don't know, and they don't know why these men would want to know such a thing. Why would a baby be placed with the nuns? Asta thinks it might be something worse than an orphan, whatever that means. So Malcolm goes back to the kitchen, ignoring Alice as usual. Though why mention her at all, if not to, again, suggest that undertone of sexuality, of sexual impropriety, of consequences, of love affairs. Then we get the uh, threat of Malcolm going to prison if he should drop the uh, the Lord Chancellor's apples. Um, but Asta notes that his mother was startled when they asked about a baby, particularly her badger Karen, which I guess is an Irish name. It can mean something like dark little one, just as Malcolm's name is Scottish and his demon is bright. Reg, his father, is associated with kingship and rule and advice. Anyhow, this otherwise placid demon, a badger, gives quite a response when a baby is mentioned. This is never exactly cleared up, but it seems that something about the question uh, is uh, tapping into some knowledge that his mother might already have of what's going on. But otherwise, Malcolm's demon says that she remained inscrutable and did not register the surprise that he was feeling and that he himself showed. Um, the the chapter ends on the note of him resolving to let the nuns know that somebody's been asking questions about them. So, how should we conclude here? I think that Malcolm's personality, his character traits, and the ways in which they parallel the setting that we're given, the world in which we find ourselves, is probably the most important thing about this initial chapter, along with the voice of the narrator, of course, and the storytelling uh, mode that we're carried along by. We see that Malcolm is innocent, but also to a degree impertinent, even rude at times, even mean towards Alice. So one criticism that we might have is that he's too good to be true, but that's based on, I think, seeing only one side of his character. The other unreality that we are in contact with here is in the sort of degree of rightness and order and sweetness of this portrayal of a world that is, of course, very much different from our own contemporary one. I think that what we can say about that, though, is that it is filtered through the eyes and experiences of this young boy before he has gained experience. I think it's also important that we bear in mind the whole of MacNeice's poem, particularly the image of the rose at the end, but of course the part that's cited about the crazy world and its incorrigible plurality is clearly of importance as well. If we look at MacNeice's own background, uh, one of the first things that I read anyway is that he had a resistance to a system of belief of his sometime mentor, W.H. Auden. Again, this is from the Poetry Foundation website. They say MacNeice did not share the ideological commitments of the so-called Auden group. From first to last, his own work reflects a melancholy skepticism, too honest to give final assent to any fixed system. MacNeice might sympathize with and even envy those who believed, but he remained a detached outsider. So there's bound to be a story there as well. How Pullman found this poem, when it became important to him, why this line in particular stuck in his mind, is all interesting to speculate on. I think we will be bound to look at that era of the 60s in literature. Particularly a poem like Howl by Allen Ginsberg is one that he also talks about as being important in his formation, his early literary uh, uh, experiences. And I think that these kinds of things will come in, particularly when we get to the Secret Commonwealth, as Lyra is influenced by certain writers and certain types of writing. All right, this has been a long, and I hope not too long, opening to a project that I at least am very excited about. I appreciate you sticking with me, and I feel very lucky that Daniel has stayed asleep this long. We're going to accelerate insofar as we'll be covering 2 chapters at a time in each episode from here on out, with those digression episodes interspersed as we see fit and as interlocutors become available. Thank you again for listening. I hope you're enjoying reading along with me, and I particularly would love to hear from you if you disagree with anything that I've said or think that I've left something out. But at any rate, I would love to hear from you, and I will be back soon with another episode. Take care.